nice. Everybody says it's the first week of spring. Okay, thank you for coming. For those of you that were on Monday's talk, this is a partner talk. It shows you how some of the ideas that I went over on Monday might be applied in practice. It also is a standalone example of how research can inform design practice in a very specific domain. So this is about a new lexicon, and I should explain things. A lexicon is not necessarily a dictionary, although in some contexts the word is used the same way. A dictionary is something that just explains the meaning of something. A lexicon contains the corpus of an entire language. So you have the lexicon on one hand and the grammar on the other hand. You can actually make everything that the language includes. So it's an extremely useful tool for students of languages, linguists, and so on. Greek, for all its sins, is an extremely central part for universities. Academic life includes reliably some department that studies modern or classical Greek, and also a lot of people who work with religious texts will study Greek at some point. So they will need something that explains what the Greek words mean, and the roots and the connections to the rest of the language. And for anybody who's ever studied Greek, the names Little Scott will mean something. This is the definitive, I can see some heads nodding, some people have been traumatized by this. This is the definitive reference work for people studying Greek. It goes back to the 19th century. It was originally based on a German equivalent work, translated to English, since then continuously expanded and reprinted. There's all sorts of versions, from small single-volume versions to multi-volume desktop versions that cover pretty much everything you might need to know. And it is something that will reliably be on the desktop of every student of classical Greek. And it looks inside like this. And this is something that we can comprehend the structure of. It's dense and it's structured. It is not something that you read from cover to cover, but you just go and find the right bit. And you will see that it has headwords, then definitions, origins. It will also have references to where you might find the word. There are references to sources. In this case, they're all abbreviated: Hippocrates, Plutarch, and so on. There might be examples of use, so the equivalent phrasing for the word. And some of these definitions might be quite long. So you have side by side fairly short entries and fairly long entries. So there's a fairly complex typographic problem. The really interesting set of problems have to do with punctuation. There's a lot of very detailed use of punctuation, spacing, abbreviations, and so on. So you might find number, punctuation, space, number, sort of space, colon, bigger space, italics, abbreviation, two punctuations, one row, and so on and so forth. So it's a typesetter's nightmare, but all of these things mean something. So it's critical that they are correct. And all of them look like this. This is the 1925 edition, nearly 100 years after the first one. It looked exactly the same. The reason for this is that typography is a fairly conservative discipline, especially for reference works. If it worked okay, the previous edition, just do the same one. In many cases, because this would include very wide character sets, the typesetting environments might only have one or two or three typefaces that would actually have the full complement of characters. Greek in particular, in its full classical variety, would have several hundred of sorts. So at the time when these were either handset or hot metal set, there really weren't that many typefaces available to choose. What we also did see is a lot of photo reproductions, photomechanical reproductions of hot metal or foundry type versions. So publishers would reprint editions just by photographically reproducing things. They might be cheaper, but essentially they perpetuated the typography of the earlier editions. So essentially we had the middle of the 19th century typographic style extending well into the 20th century and even now. So Cambridge University Press decided 14 years ago to update this thing and produce an intermediate Greek-English lexicon. Now intermediate in sort of academics term, which is something this thick, but the idea was that it would be a single volume that students could take with them. The editors worked on this project for over 10 years. They were extremely prescient, I think, in putting everything into very well structured XML files. It was not a database, it was an XML file with a lot of annotations for the editors as well as the typesetters. There were a lot of different versions of entries in the XML files, and all of these things were, let's say, accessed by a number of people at the same time. So a very, very smart way of doing a publication like this. Of course, XML is not very friendly for editors to read, so what they did was they used a service that would output structured XML into PDF documents according to a specific set of fonts that they had. The fonts, of course, looked exactly like what I showed you. Now, the important thing with all of this thing is that the conventions we think of about typesetting do not apply here. There is no way that you could go through the whole thing and fix things. It needs to be absolutely robust and correct the moment you're done. In a sense, you can imagine typesetting this as a big red button, and you feed it something, then hit the big red button, and typeset pages come out the other end, and there's thousands of them because there's no way you can fix them. So it really needs to work. And the stuff looks like this. It's some sort of structured XML. It's really difficult to find the bits of content because there's a huge amount of information explaining what the little bits of content are, and it's really unfriendly. Yeah? The problem is that the conventions for typesetting these kind of big works, by the time that Cambridge were looking into production, had shifted to these large works being done overseas, in this case in India. And this is one of the proofs that the Indian typesetters were sending back. They would receive the XML files. The little leaflet is an A5, just so you get an idea. And they would send back these pages, which were scaled up from the intended page size of the book to fit the width of the A3 printout. So you can immediately begin to see problems, which means that because the proof that editors were looking at was about 1.4 times bigger than the actual thing. What looks readable there would probably not be readable in the actual size, but this is hidden by the scaling. And also this happens at the other end of an email, so you really cannot sit with the typesetter and proof things. So you can only use whatever is available there. In this case, they were using old Type 1 fonts, old 8-bit fonts that didn't have a very wide character set, so they had to use a lot of fonts at the same time. Very quickly, the editors realized that there were problems with this thing, and if they were really going to have an impact in the market, it had to actually look as modern as the editorship was. To give you an idea of the target for this thing, this is a book, again by Cambridge, which was the model for portability, let's say. It's about this thing. It's a chunk. Now, this is 1,600 pages, 1,600 pages. And this was the target that the editors were working at. Now, this is an interesting story and a lesson in humility for designers, because throughout this project, the most important person is the bookbinder. When we tested this thing, the paper that was available for this edition would allow us to get 1,600 pages into a single volume. Throughout the lifetime of the project, the paper was not available anymore. We could not actually get 1,600 pages in, we could only get 1,400 pages in. Now, if you tell some editors that you're going to lose 200 pages of text, this is not good news for them. So there's a lot of discussion about what are we going to do, we need to get these entries in, it's really important, blah, blah, blah. So the design then needs to accommodate the extra space that you need. Okay, you might start fiddling with things like margins and so on, type sizes, but of course, there's only so many ways that you can play with margin when you have a thing that is 1,400 pages and need to open. And you also have issues like the age of the readership, which might be quite advanced, so they won't be able to read things. And you also have the problem that a lot of the readers are students of the language, so they might not be able to detect errors. You need to make sure that everything that is there is unambiguously distinguishable. So we started working on the typographic side of things. This is what the proofs look like. You don't need to be able to read Greek for this to see that there are some things that look odd. And you can see in these cases that in the middle of the word there's a character that looks oddly different. That's because the fonts that were used by the typesetter did not have the right characters, so they just went and fetched another font. That's it, let's just drop it in. And it's lighter in that case. Or in this case, a completely different style. Now, you also have other issues, that these are the important bits. If you're trying to read this thing, you go down the left side, you try and find the head word, this is the word that I'm looking for, and then you're going to read the rest bits. But if you look at it, these are not the most important things. Then you might find that there's a huge number of numbers and symbols, parentheses, numbers that have entries, superscripts, mathematical symbols, and so on, which are fetched from all sorts of different typefaces, just whatever is there. That creates a very busy typographic texture that doesn't have the hierarchy. You won't be able to figure out which are the important bits, which are the less important bits, which are conditional bits, and so on. The spacing also is very uneven, because each of these fonts has its own spacing, and it might have its own spacing character that goes with that stuff. And then you have things like this, which for type designers are very irregular problems. You don't normally have regular, non-Latin, italic, other font, bold. Now, in the normal type design testing routines, this is not something that comes up very often. So you needed something that would have some sort of coordination between the different weights. I'd say the first time I went to a meeting with the editors, they said, show us designs. And I was empty-handed, said, I cannot show you any designs. I need to figure out in my head how this thing works. I need to understand the content. So what we did was we did a lot of stuff like that. I just started asking stupid questions. As if I knew nothing, what does this mean? What does this need to do? Which bits do I read first? Which bits can I not make sense of what the head word is without reading, and so on. So I made a lot of stuff like this, and then I started making mock-ups of individual little chunks of text, trying to see, for snippets of text, whether the visual hierarchy I had in mind would sort of work. It's just testing people with little bits of text. Now, the difficult thing with this is that you have multiple weights that need to show emphasis, but in a reasonable cascade. Some things are really important, some things are less important. You can see there the superscript is huge, the bolds are too bold. It really doesn't click together. But it gave us something to begin to work. And what I then did was translate this into just a semantic structure. To strip away all the specific content and try to figure this out in terms of the information that was embedded in the XML files. So they said everything that is head lemma might be associated with a part of speech, which would be in italics and so on. So I'm sort of skirting between design and information structure, which I then translated into this, which this is not real XML, this is just fake XML. But I'm using the terminology of the XML so that I could then see which bits were represented by which instructions. And you'll see later why this was so important. But I had some idea of, let's say, the parts of the speech for this dictionary. And then we started testing. It's really interesting because you see through this kind of proofing which bits are missing in the system. In a sense, if you have a controlled typography, especially one that might be overly homogeneous, then the bits that the system has not figured out will stick out. Okay? And you can imagine that you might have a document that has its styles well set up, and if you flick your base style on something else, it will really stand out. It's this equivalent testing that we did in this case. We found a number of interesting stuff that I'm going to show you some earlier. The idea is that we would end up with something, there's no way you can read this, we would end up with something like this. Because we figured out that we needed to have a fairly high degree of typographic control. We decided to use open type fonts that would allow us to have a much smaller character set. And we needed typesetters who were, let's say, brave. That's because these very massive typesetting engines in many places still do not work with OpenType fonts. They will use old Type 1 fonts. And people with experience in the newspaper industry will have echoes of this in their mind, where newspaper typesetting systems, possibly even to these days, do not work with OpenType fonts. They use Type 1 fonts. So we needed something that we could convert a specification to a typesetter, who in this case was somewhere in the north of England, that would have bits like this, that said, the lemma, which has an XML structure, HL, will use this style at this point size and so on, which they could then input into a computer program that would take the XML on one and put all the instructions for this time and then spit out the thing. The fun bit is that not all the black bits of ink that you see on the paper have been keyed in, but a lot of the stuff is automatically generated. So this specific, which was this was part of speech, say class, would automatically enter a full stop after the style was finished. But there might be a comma that somebody entered by hand later. So the proofs would not tell you which bits were actually entered by the editors and which were automatically generated by the XML. So it's an extremely smart system if you know that it will always do the right thing. And this was very widely used to save people work. So even things like brackets, square brackets, superscripting would all be done without people seeing things. So I tried to translate this into some sort of specification that would make sense to me, because I haven't decided what typefaces to use. And I thought, I need things like this, heavy and not so heavy, a regular. So I was always trying to think in relative terms, because I had no idea what I could find out there. And the most important things were the references, the relation between the Greek and the Latin. Now, to give you an idea of some of the problems, the top line is standard modern Greek, which is monotonic, has a single accent over vowels. Polytonic Greek has up to 5 different combinations, 6 different combinations of diacritics. But the kind of Greek that you will find in the dictionary would also have 2 additional markers like the bar there that would show you whether a vowel is long or short. So we're talking about a profusion of diacritics over characters at a very small size. This is just what you would get for one vowel. Not all of the vowels would have as many, but 3 of the vowels would have as many, and there were a lot of other characters that had quite a few. So I started trying to figure out how to deal with this. The limiting factor clearly would be the Greek, because there weren't that many fonts that had all the characters. So I first tried to use Fedra. That's not Fedra, that's a font substitution, because I had to return it. We didn't use it in the end, so I had to delete the fonts from my license. Fedra didn't work. It's a Sans, it was a bit too heavy. So then I went and tried out Scholar by David Brezina. The good thing with Scholar is that the designer is an old student of mine, so if I needed something done to it, I could actually bully him into doing it. But it is a couple of years back, so it didn't have all the weights that it has now. And I couldn't get it to work with all the different weights that I needed. So then I thought, okay, I'll take a step back and perhaps remember all the stuff about history that I like so much. So I went back several hundred years and looked at some really old books to remind myself what did dictionaries look like when people really started looking at that stuff. This is 1572 by Estienne. In this case, it's something much simpler, because there's just a correlation between Latin and Greek, but there is a very distinct adoption of the cursive Greek style. Fairly later on, we see this style surviving quite well wherever it is, either on its own, but also embedded with Latin. And this is something that continues for quite a few editions. Even to these days, this idea of matching a more cursive Greek with more conventional Latin has quite a lot of currency, and it is increasingly used to differentiate between the languages. This is an Italian edition of the Iliad, designed by Giovanni Lussu 3 or 4 years ago. So I started thinking with a more open mind, walking away from the 19th century typography. Not a bad idea also, if you think that 19th century was not the high point of text typography. There are a couple of digital examples. This is Matthew Carter's Miller Greek with his version of Alexander Wilson's Greek. Now, it's been used in a reference work, but in that work there was a huge amount of English with a very small amount of Greek in it, and I thought it was just far too busy. Plus there's only one style, which sort of killed the project. But I kept that thing in mind. John Hudson had designed this very well done typeface, which has a huge complement of characters for the Society of Biblical Literature, which is everything I needed and then some. The problem is that there's only one weight. If you're studying things like the Bible, you only need one weight. It doesn't even have an italic, so it's completely useless for me. So I went and started looking at Adobe fonts. I've had the pleasure of working quite a bit with Robert Slimbach on the Adobe fonts, so I know them quite intimately, so I know how they work. What you see here is Garamond Premiere Pro, Arno Pro, and Minion Pro that were out at the time, since there are a couple more Adobe typefaces that have full character sets that are out there. Now, Robert Slimbach is one of those designers that spends a huge amount of time developing each family to a, some would say, excessive degree. So you might have, this is Garamond, you might have a regular, a medium, a semi-bold, and a bold, so there's 4 weights there already. But then he also has optical sizes. So you have the regular and the subhead, and the caption and the display. Now if you do the calculation, that's 16 different variants for each typeface, because you have 4 optical sizes for 4 weights. I'm thinking, that's actually okay, I need to enjoy this. And I look particularly at Arno, which had a slightly wider character set and was a little bit more toned down. And I could use this to get exactly the right kind of distinction between the bolder Greeks and the less strong ones. So I've got a wide typographic palette there that was a good starting point to work with the Latin. So I started looking at the Latin, which I suspect would be easier to choose because I have more to choose from. So I went back to Miller, but Miller has an extremely busy italic. It's a typical Scotch Roman typeface. The italic would be used for small bits of text within a larger paragraph of Latin or of English. Not very good if you already got that busy Greek. I needed something that was way more restrained. So I looked at a number of typefaces in the Scotch Roman style, which I felt had the sturdiness that this project required, and settled on the one below. The top is Miller still, but the bottom is Chronicle text by Hoefler and Ferrer-Jones. Now, Chronicle has 3 weights, it's regular and semi-bold and bold, and you see the bold is really heavy. But, and if you're a book typographer, you'll share my excitement. It has grades. You can see a very small difference between these things. Now, grades are, I don't know, what's the porn equivalent of type? For those who don't know, grades are type that is in exactly the same spacing, but slightly lighter or slightly heavier. And the origin of grades is so that you can calibrate presses. So you're printing the same edition in 2 different parts of the country. Very big problem in the States where daily editions need to be printed in different parts of the country, and one press prints heavy, one press prints light. You fiddle things with grades, but there is no text reflow. It's fantastic. Which means then you can have 4 different styles that don't change your reflow, times 3, of course, weights to play with. So this is really nice. I get very excited at that stuff. My wife thinks this is sad. So we started producing things, and immediately the first thing we did was just scale everything down to 1-to-1 scale. Just get the editors to begin to give us feedback on things that would look at the size of the actual printed thing rather than proofs. We ended up with 2 columns. Now, in a reference work, whether you go for 1 column or 2 columns or 3 columns, depends very much on the average length of entries. And everything depends on the really short entries, whether they will be long enough to fit in one line or whether they will just carry over and then you get a long leftover bit which will mess things up. Two columns ended up giving the best compromise in terms of fitting as much stuff as we could in. We tried to have fairly clean and open styling, so things like successive number sequences, number entries would have their own starting line. And we started running into a number of tests and seeing problems. First of all, we realized that there's a really big problem if your testers, in this case the editors, are really familiar with the text. Because there might be wrong characters or errors that they will not see because they know exactly what to read. And you might have observed this yourself sometimes. You've read a word and you've read a specific way, then you realize that there's an error in typing and you've gone over it. And in this case, we would find that, especially in cases where the older typefaces that they were used to seeing for years did not have clearly distinguished characters, so the shapes of the characters were not distinct enough, things would have been keyed in or let through the text stream in the wrong way. So the two bold characters at the bottom would be a problem because they are different, they mean different things, but they will be used interchangeably. We would also have problems with stacking accents. Because this dictionary, you want to cram things in. Remember, we've got 200 pages less to make up for. So the space between the X height of one line and the baseline of the other is really very heavily competed for. And we would find out that they would read things that were, for a typographer, really obviously wrong. Now, the two bits you see there in the circle were in small capitals in the specification. The system did not read them as small capitals, it output them as some sort of font that it found somewhere. This is probably Adobe Serif, which is substituted in PDFs, but they read it fine. So we came up with a number of problems like this. We also found that the system would not scale horizontally everything that we told it to scale horizontally. Now, this is one of those things that typeface designers might be really uptight about. Don't scale my typeface horizontally, it's perfect just as it is. But especially with longer texts, actually you do quite a lot of stuff like that. And people, again, working in reference works, newspapers and so on, 98% scaling might save you quite a bit at the end. And if the typeface is designed in a way that will handle that kind of stuff, it's absolutely fine. But again, in this case, the difference between the two is quite big. And we had serious problems because these would cascade down. So the nearly final looks a bit like this. This is not completely final. But there is now a clear cascade between the bold of the head words and then a cascade of, let's say, semi-bold other entry points that you might see in the entry, plus a clear and relatively homogeneous texture within the entry, so you don't have something that is too distracting to read. And I'll say, it looks better if you put it in print. I tried to drop in a fully spelled out initial word for the chapters, for the letters. At some point it was there, then they said, no, we can't have this, dictionaries and things like that always have just a single letter. They put that in there, and a couple of months later I saw my earlier design coming in. I didn't say anything. I'm hoping it will survive to the end. There was a footnote to this, and it echoes things that I talked about earlier, have to do with being able to distinguish bits clearly. And if you look at these two examples, you will see that the accent on the top line is fairly smaller than the accent on the bottom line. On one level, that reflects the style of Slimba, who designs his accents relatively small, but it's a real problem with the very small and dense typesetting we're having in the dictionary and the density of accents. So most of the work that had to do with type was especially spent in me modifying the accents and making them bigger, then the editors coming back and saying, no, bigger. And me trying to make them a little bit bigger and fit them in the space we had, then the editors coming back and saying, no, bigger still, and so on and so forth. So what we did was we modified a number of letters, like the lambda you will see is much longer at the top than the bottom, so it would make space to not clash with the accents before, and we would increase as much as we could the size of the accent. You can see the left and the right are quite different in size. We also changed completely the shape of the Greek perispomeni, which looks like a tilde on the bottom left example, but it looks like a semicircle on the bottom right. Again, everything in the effort to increase the apparent size of things so that they would be visible. Again, what we managed to do was also compress the descenders and ascenders of the Greek to the level of the Latin of chronicle, which had very short descenders, so we could clear as much as possible of the space above, and it seems to work. Now, yeah, there's a couple of accents still to fix on this proof. What did we learn from this thing? I get a lot of stick for this conclusion, but in the design of a document that has a lot of text and is critical for its users, typefaces are not the most important thing. You will find a lot of typeface designers expecting typographers to start by choosing the typefaces. And very much this is not the case. You really need to think of the document structure, of the conditions that come from production, or the specific conditions the users might be bringing into this. Having said that, you do need to get the typefaces right. That within the genre that you're working with, within the styles that you're working with, and especially in the complement of types that you're using, you can get things wrong very easily if the typefaces do not support the document structure. When you're choosing typefaces, relative values are much more important than the specifics. So you could have, I'm pretty sure, an equally effective typographically design by using typefaces in very different genres, as long as the relationships of weight and style within the other members were equivalent. So hierarchies visually were maintained, and ideas of which is more important and which is less important were also maintained. And that it all boils down to getting a lot of details right. Things like the 6.5% scaling of the abbreviations, which, if you look at a single set of entries, might be a millimeter and a whole column width. Well, multiply this by 1,400 pages times 2 columns, that's 2,800 times a millimeter. That's several meters that you've wasted in that 106.5% of scaling that went wrong. Or little details like the accents not being different enough from others, which for someone like me might be easy to see, but for someone who is learning through that text at that moment, if they're not very distinguishable, might actually lead to wrong conclusions. I have to say, projects like this are also very interesting because they bring people from very different disciplines together. So the technologist that has to set up the XML files in a way that works with the editors. A whole team of editors who might not see each other for months, but still have to contribute to essentially the same body of work. A typographer and type designer who might have only superficial knowledge of the other people's domains. I can understand the general gist of XML, I cannot write that stuff. I know some stuff about the production limitations, I'm not a specialist. So the best thing you can do from this is to learn to play stupid. And just ask a lot of questions. If you didn't say right at the beginning, you know what, this presents a very big learning challenge for me. I'm just going to ask stupid questions, tell me if you think they're stupid, but actually give me the answer as well, and we'll see what we get here. And in the end, you might end up with something that looks okay, will print in 1,400 pages, and will actually help people not only read well, but also see that this is a document that was produced in 2010 rather than 1890 like all the other ones on the shelf. I will close with a bitter irony, which I think a lot of us will be able to identify with. When we started the project, the areas in the Cambridge University Press facilities, when we're working, still house the last of the presses there. You walk down the corridor, you could hear the presses rumbling away. In the sort of 2.5 years that the project took, all of that space had been emptied, and the space of the presses had been turned into space for commissioners of books, magazines, journals, and so on, and people who would work on a desk with a computer in front of them. Anything that had to do with, let's say, conventional production of stuff on paper had completely vanished. It was essentially a publishing operation like anything else, which is a little bit sad for these publishing houses that have histories that go back several hundreds of years, and you would expect have a certain embedded know-how in how to do things that I think just gets lost very easily. The other irony, the last irony, is that this is the last large reference work they said they would do in print. Yes, these things sell at a very slow pace for decades, but because people learn in very different ways now, it's just not worth it. So thankfully for them, they've got it all on the XML, but this will end up somewhere online. So you buy a subscription to your institution, and I presume you have some sort of swanky interface that allows you to dig up the headword you want, but it won't be in print anymore. And all of this dimension of these reference works having a certain heft to them and a volume that represents the hours you've spent as a student, and then you remind yourself of those hours by using them to prop your screen up. That's all gone. So there's a bit of a sadness in this. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
What do you think about the e-versions of dictionaries?
I think reference works will undoubtedly go on some sort of online platform much faster than they're already going. For two reasons. First of all, because the nature of reference work is one of cross-linked bits of information rather than something serial. So anybody who remembers reading a dictionary or an encyclopedia and then saying, "Oh shit, that volume, get the other one out, open it, look it up," it's frustrating and annoying. It's really nice to be able to click something or look at things side by side. What is not there yet is a really efficient interface that will allow us not to see a specific email, which is easy, it's a small paragraph, but actually do something more than what we would do with just a print edition. So this idea that you have a student on a table with 10 books open at the same time is something that we have not been able to replicate very efficiently in an online environment, especially in relatively small screens. If you think of tablets, that's actually quite an important consideration, because the nature of inquiry is one of cross-referencing, okay? Which a table will make it easy to do. It's very slow and sometimes inefficient, but at the moment on a tablet is nigh on impossible. So I think that is the distinction. The problem is that the people who make that stuff are thinking of books, things, as individual products. So there's a dictionary that's a standalone product, whereas the act of using the dictionary is something that involves a lot of different texts and sources that need to be brought together. And so far we've been really good at making accessible individual slivers of text rather than a lot of things that are connected together. Does this answer your question? Please.
When you show on the slide that the scale was 98%. What's the margin for 2%? What's more?
But the 98% was one of the core typefaces that was for text. So actually, that 2% does add up. Depending on how the typeface is designed, that might be really visible. If the typeface has a lot of gentle curves, that will stand out. For the Greek, you couldn't do this because it's full of curves. But Chronicle is designed for newspapers, so it has a lot of right angles, of curves joining the strokes. There's a certain chunkiness and sturdiness. And if you scale it, you don't lose very much of the style of the typeface. You lose a little bit of space from inside, but not very much. And it will add up if it is the main core typeface. You could test this by taking a typeface you work with and scale it 98% and see, can you tell the difference? Because when the reader gets this, they don't get a sticker at the front that says, attention, typeface scale 98%. They don't know. So if the typeface looks okay at 98%, perhaps it means that you were quite fine. What has been even more useful, which has been possible since digital typesetting, is incremental type sizes. That is even more powerful, because you might want a typeface that works fine at 9.3 points. Before, you might not be able to have this. Optical photo typesetters were able to do this, I think with a little bit more care, because you really need to get the machine to work correctly when you play with light. But digital typesetting allows you to do this with a very forgiving environment. So you could have second decimal point sizes, and that allows you to fine-tune a lot, especially typefaces that were not designed together. You will also find designers who will have very different views about the relative size of the bolds to the regulars. Yeah? If they studied under the influence of the international style, they might be under the misconception that bolds need to be the same height as the regulars. That's bad, because the bold then has a much smaller proportion to the counters, which would be much smaller. These days you will find type designers designing the bolds a fair amount bigger than the regulars, taller. But you might need to adjust this if you only have one word of bold next to the regulars. You will also see that the shape of the italics, especially depending on how wide or narrow they are, will influence how tall they look. Because an italic that has a steep angle will have a narrower sort of oblong counter, so there's a longer bit of white space in there, even if it is less area. So you might want to knock down from a quarter of a point the italics to make it look even with the regular. As I said, this is really game and stuff. You do it because you trust it will have an impact in the final product at the level of detail that perhaps you and your peers will see. And perhaps that's the good thing, that the users will not be able to see this. They'll just see something that works okay, and that's your reward. Yes?
Does the scaling work the same on screen as in print? Does it do the same?
You're sort of asking the wrong question. Because the scaling does not happen to see the detail of the type in a specific way. It happens so that you see the paragraph in a specific way. So you fit the amount of text in, and that things will look with a particular evenness when you have a certain high precision in the production. And you will not get text overflowing, especially the horizontal scaling. When you render something on screen, then you have a problem of each environment that will fit your black bits and your white bits onto its own grid. What you cannot predict is the zoom level at which your reader will see things. Yeah? Because you're young and you see things at small size, but I'm at that age where half the time I take my glasses off, and no, or I might do this and this. I just say, and just press Command plus and the thing zooms in, which the typography remains constant, but actually I've just increased the effective resolution of the rendering tenfold. Yeah. So I think we forget that the great benefit of the digital rendering is primarily the customization by the user of the conditions of use. So you might be able to have a by default bigger size for the text. It gets much more interesting, which is where your question really is relevant, in really small screen sizes, where if you scale up, you really have text flow problems, or you might not be able to get all the text you want in. And I think in those cases, you're really looking at what is good enough. Until a few years ago, the good enough on screen was not very good. But with the kind of screen resolution we have now, with iPhones the last three generations, and most good Android phones and so on, and increasingly laptops, well, the new Mac, which is lovely, and the Google laptop thing, whatever its name, the latest Toshiba, very high screen densities that are effectively over the limits of your eyes being able to see exactly. So you have some that's at least as good as print quality, or at least laser print quality on screen. Add then the customization that you might get by the user, and I think that's not the problem. The problem then is how do you adapt an environment that limits the amount of stuff you can see to a workflow that works much better when you can see a huge amount of stuff all at the same time. And so all the information that you can bring in. This makes sense. There is also a footnote in this that on screen rendering things change so quickly that it's really difficult to design for a specific environment. Both because the technology of screens gets cheaper, so better screens become more and more prevalent, but also because the most dominant way of looking at things on screen is through a browser. So the browser rendering engine becomes the dominant text rendering environment for most people. It might be something through a browser visibly, or it might be something that uses the browser rendering engine, even if it looks like an application on your iPad or other tablet. So what the guys are doing at WebKit or whatever to improve the rendering is probably much more important than what Adobe is doing for its own page layout applications for this. And I think that is the really big thing, that we move into a situation where you just have a browser in front of you and just renders text. Yes?
I've got a question. So all these tiny bits and details, who actually redesigned them, or you commission anyone, or?
No, I did those.
You did them?
Yeah.
So what is the problem, like, with the end user license? So.
You
know, we always.
Chronicle, I couldn't touch Chronicle.
Yes, but.
So one of the reasons of choosing Chronicle was that it did everything I needed to do without me needing to touch the fonts. So I had the license for the fonts, and the typesetters had the license for the fonts, and that's fine. But Adobe is very open with its licenses, and as long as you rename the fonts, then you can do things to them. So they were renamed as CUT, Lexicon, whatever, something, and it's fine. Yeah, so as long as the naming is different, Adobe allows you to do this.
Because this is sort of the same problem we had like 15 years ago, adding diacritics to many fonts were sort of not allowed to do.
Absolutely, and there has been a very big process of education of type designers, especially, can I say, I don't like using East and West and Central European things because these things don't matter, don't work. You can use a very crude distinction by talking about typefaces that were designed for a market that was not properly international, in which case diacritics would essentially be French diacritics. Yeah? So you would get people getting copies or whatever. They might be in Poland or Czech Republic or wherever. And they would generally have to hack the fonts because the fonts did not have the diacritics they needed, or they had them badly designed. Right? I know that all the Polish designers of the late 80s and the 90s would sort of intentionally open up and change the fonts because the accents were wrong. Right? And what can you do? Because at that time, the international market for fonts was not developed. Not everybody could buy fonts with a credit card over the internet. And also, people who design fonts did not know enough about what needed to be done. Now, that is just a historical fact now. The market was not open, we did not have enough information, okay. The problem with fonts is that they have extremely long shelf lives. And if you're my age, you've got fonts on your computer that are older than a lot of the people in the audience. And fonts are the only bit of software that will work 25 years later. And that's a bit of a problem, is that you want them to die out, because then all of these really old hacks and compromises survive. Whereas, I need every 2 or 3 years, I need to change my applications and I get the serial number and update it. In a sense, it will iron out all bugs, so I can get InDesign now, and it will be able to spell check Polish, whereas 5 years ago it didn't. But the fonts I had 5 years ago might still have the old style accents and not the ones that will be good enough to render all languages. There is another aspect to this, that it is possible now for open type fonts to include the intelligence that alters things like diacritics for specific regions. So you might say French accents, Polish accents, Czech accents, Slovenian accents. Yeah, that's fine. It's perfectly possible to do the technology for OpenType. InDesign supports it, and it is not too difficult for an informed designer to find the information for it. Your weak link then in the chain is your typesetter, because the font, for the font to turn on the right kind of diacritics, it needs to read the style sheet, the style. So whenever you see someone in Word typing with normal style sheet, instead of some that says Slovenian, the thing doesn't know it's reading Slovenian, it thinks it reads American English. Yeah? So it will not fetch the right spelling dictionary or hyphenation it needs, and of course it will not fetch the right accents. So all the links in the chain need to be hooked up for the system to work, and I think that is where things are much more difficult, because in a time when children in Slovenia are doing their school reports by looking up things on Wikipedia and perhaps copy-pasting things from here and there, which also brings the styles into the document, then you have documents that are quite impure in terms of what they think the text is. So you might then see all sorts of stuff happening with the fonts. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.